All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. This is where you bring us the source material, articles, notes, whatever knowledge you've uncovered, and we jump in together. We plot the key ideas, look for those, surprising links, basically help you get truly informed without drowning in the details.
Think of it like we're navigating the info landscape you provide, pointing out the important landmarks.
Exactly. And today, we've got a really fascinating piece. It's a source describing an audio lecture series from 1960 by the philosopher Walter Kaufmann.
That's right, Walter Kaufmann.
And we're zooming in on the part where he discusses Søren Kierkegaard.
Yeah, stepping back to 1960 is interesting. Existentialism wasn't brand new, obviously. Its roots go way back.
Right.
But by the mid-20th century, it was definitely hitting the mainstream more, causing quite a stir, beyond just philosophy departments.
Right. And this source, this description, it gives us a window into how a major figure like Kaufmann introduced these thinkers, how he framed them for that audience at that moment in time.
Exactly. So we're looking at his framing, his structure, his main points, but only as they're presented in the summary you shared with us. That's key.
Okay. So our mission for this deep dive. Let's unpack Kaufmann's perspective on Kierkegaard and related figures, but strictly based on the context and points outlined in this summary description. We want to understand the lens Kaufmann was using back then.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So first, let's get a feel for the lecturer and the time. Walter Kaufmann, he was a big deal philosopher, translator, especially known for his work on Nietzsche, actually. And the source says 1960. What does that bring to mind? Well, the world was still very much processing World War II. The Cold War was really ramping up.
Yeah, a lot of anxiety, right? Questioning traditional structures, searching for meaning.
Precisely. A time when questions about individual freedom, responsibility, maybe the lack of inherent meaning, they'd land with real weight.
And the title of the series itself, the full title described in the source, it's really revealing about Kaufmann's approach, isn't it?
It absolutely is. He sets it up around three main figures, and each one is tied to a specific kind of crisis. It's Kierkegaard and the crisis in religion, then Nietzsche and the crisis in philosophy, and finally Sartre and the crisis in morality.
Wow. Okay, so that structure alone tells you a lot. He's not just giving us, separate bios or philosophical rundowns.
No, not at all. He's presenting these thinkers, and they are distinct, let's be clear, as key figures responding to these major upheavals, these crises in modern Western thought.
So he sees their work as directly tackling issues in, faith, knowledge, ethics.
Exactly. It's not just history for him. The way he frames it suggests it's immediately relevant to the big questions people were asking in 1960.
And something else stood out from the description about the Kierkegaard part specifically. The summary says this is part 1 of 3 lectures overall, focusing on Kierkegaard. But then it mentions the audio files referenced are Kierkegaard part 1 and Kierkegaard part 2.
Ah, good point. That does suggest something important. It implies that even within this 3-part structure, Kierkegaard got significant airtime. At least 2 whole lectures, possibly more.
Which tells you how important Kaufmann thought Kierkegaard was for his overall argument, right?
It really does. It signals that, according to Kaufmann's framing in this summary, Kierkegaard wasn't just, 1/3 of the puzzle. He was seen as absolutely central to understanding that crisis in religion. He needed dedicated focus.
So Kaufmann is positioning Kierkegaard as foundational for grappling with modern spiritual issues leading up to 1960.
Seems like it. Essential viewing, or listening, if you wanted to understand the challenges to faith back then.
The source description also lists the topics covered: philosophy, religion, morality, existentialism, even the lecture itself, apparently, and Kierkegaard, of course.
Yeah, it's a wide scope, but clearly organized around these figures and the crises Kaufmann links them to. It feels like it was meant as a high-level but quite pointed introduction to these major currents seen through Kaufmann's specific viewpoint.
Okay, so moving into the actual content described, the summary says Kaufmann kicks things off by talking about existentialists. And his first point is that they share as many differences as other schools of philosophy.
Which is a really smart place to start, isn't it? Especially in 1960. The term existentialism was probably being tossed around, maybe vaguely.
Right, people might just lump them all together: Sartre, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche.
Exactly. So Kaufmann, right away, according to this summary, is doing some important groundwork. He's saying, hold on, it's not a monolith. He's signaling complexity, individuality, setting the stage for nuance.
That tells you he's not going for a simplistic overview. He wants to show their distinctiveness.
And then building on that, The description mentions the term existentialism itself. It says the term was first coined to refer to the theories of Jaspers and Heidegger.
Okay, so that's the specific origin story, the academic birth of the label.
Yeah, the official etymology, you could say,
Right.
linked to those specific thinkers, Jaspers and Heidegger, and their particular ideas.
But then, the summary immediately says the term only became well known after the work of Kierkegaard, Sartre, and Nietzsche.
And that's the crucial distinction Kaufmann seems to be making, based on this summary. He's separating the, let's say, academic coining of the word from the cultural impact and spread of the ideas, or at least related ideas.
So Jaspers and Heidegger might have invented the label.
But it was Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre, these powerful, maybe more provocative writers who made the concepts, the feeling of existentialism, familiar to a wider audience by 1960.
Even though Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were writing much earlier, in the 19th century.
Right. Their impact resonated later, alongside Sartre, who was very contemporary in 1960. Kaufmann's highlighting this piece of intellectual history.
He's saying, here's the footnote on the word's origin, but if you want to know why people are talking about existentialism, look at the impact of these three.
It shows he's interested not just in the philosophical timeline, but in how ideas catch on, their cultural weight, how they move from academic circles into the, broader conversation.
Why emphasize that point, do you think, in the lectures?
Well, maybe to make the term feel less abstract, to ground it in the actual writings and, frankly, the compelling personalities of the figures he's focusing on. He's kind of promising to show the living ideas that gave the term its power, not just dissect the word itself.
And it also reinforces that warning about diversity, doesn't it? The label covers figures with really different projects and contexts.
Absolutely. So, okay, he set the stage. Existentialism is diverse. The term has this specific history, but its popular recognition comes from these three key figures. Then, the source description tells us what Kaufmann sees as the main thing connecting Kierkegaard, Sartre, and Nietzsche. He calls them collectively all radical individualists.
Radical individualists. That's a strong label, based just on the summary's context that they're an answer to crises, that they found other systems lacking. What might Kaufmann mean by that?
Well, purely inferring from the summary. Radical individualist in philosophy usually points to a really intense focus on the single human being, prioritizing the individual's experience, their subjectivity, their freedom, choice, responsibility, maybe even their isolation.
Over what? Over, like, collective identity, societal norms, universal laws, big abstract systems?
Exactly. It suggests a challenge to philosophies that might absorb the individual into some larger whole, God's plan, historical necessity, the state, objective reason, whatever it might be.
So a radical individualist puts the person's concrete struggle right at the center.
That seems likely. For Kierkegaard, maybe it's that intensely personal, subjective relationship with God, standing alone. For Nietzsche, perhaps the idea of the individual forging their own values. For Sartre, that stark freedom and burden of choice in a godless world. Kaufmann's using this one term, radical individualist, to draw a thematic line connecting them, despite their differences.
And the description immediately links this individualism to their critique of what came before. It says these three found previous philosophical systems lacking.
Lacking. It sounds mild, but it feels significant here, doesn't it?
Yeah, like a major criticism. Lacking, in what sense do you think Kaufmann meant, based on the summary?
Given the radical individualist tag and the crisis framing, it seems highly probable he meant they were lacking in their ability to address the actual lived reality of an individual person.
Which systems? Maybe like Hegel's big system, or Enlightenment rationalism, or maybe even certain kinds of established theology.
Quite possibly. Those grand, often abstract systems that maybe prioritized universals or historical forces or objective reason. Kaufmann might be suggesting they failed to really connect with the anxiety, the freedom, the subjectivity, the uncertainty that individuals face, especially in the modern world.
So they couldn't provide real guidance or meaning for a person grappling with existence, particularly after, say, the World Wars or with growing secularism.
That feels like the implication. The critique isn't just about logical flaws, it's about existential inadequacy. They didn't speak to the core human condition, the individual facing fundamental choices.
Okay, so the radical individualism of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre emerges, in Kaufmann's view, as a response to that failure.
He seems to be building that narrative.
Yeah.
Traditional philosophy wasn't enough for the individual. These radical individualists saw that gap, and they offered something centered on the personal struggle.
And this is where, as the outline said, it gets really interesting. Kaufmann doesn't just see them as critics. He sees their work as an answer.
Yes, that's the core thesis presented in the source description. It's not just that they reacted to modern problems. Kaufman argues, according to the summary, that their writings constitute an answer to the modern crisis in religious philosophy and morality.
An answer. That's a powerful claim. It elevates them beyond critique.
Definitely. It suggests their work offers something constructive, a way forward, or at least a profound way to reorient oneself in the face of these deep challenges.
So Kaufman connects the dots. Previous systems failed the individual, leading to crises.
And the work of these radical individualists, focused on subjective experience and freedom, emerged as a necessary answer to those crises in religion, philosophy, and morality, as seen around 1960.
Let's drill down on Kierkegaard specifically, since that's the first part of the series. Kierkegaard and the crisis in religion.
Right. Based only on this summary, Kaufman links Kierkegaard primarily and directly to the crisis in religion.
This summary doesn't spell out how Kaufman argues Kierkegaard is an answer, does it?
No, it doesn't give us the step-by-step, but the framing itself is huge. It implies Kaufman saw Kierkegaard's unique ideas, subjective truth, the leap of faith, his critique of easy cultural Christianity, the individual's responsibility before God, faith as his intense personal choice.
He saw all that as directly relevant to the problems facing religion in the mid-20th century.
That's what the framing suggests. Think about 1960. Rising science, secularism, maybe established churches seeming out of touch, the moral questions raised by the wars. Kaufman seems to be positioning Kierkegaard's intense focus on the individual's subjective faith, maybe even against external authorities or easy answers, as a powerful response to that whole situation.
So, not necessarily providing new doctrines, but maybe a new way to understand what faith is in an age of doubt.
That could be it. Kaufman, as summarized here, seems to draw a direct line from Kierkegaard's 19th century struggles to the spiritual landscape of 1960. He's arguing Kierkegaard offers crucial concepts, maybe anxiety, despair, authenticity, subjectivity, that are vital for navigating the crisis of belief. He's presenting him as offering necessary, if maybe unsettling, answers.
It paints Kaufman as someone really engaged with how past thinkers speak to the present, doesn't it?
Very much so. He's not treating Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre as museum pieces. He's arguing they provide essential tools for understanding and dealing with the big problems of his own time.
Now, we absolutely have to stress this point again. Our source material here is a description, a summary of the lectures, not the lectures themselves.
Absolutely crucial constraint. We have to keep reminding ourselves, and you, the listener, we're analyzing Kaufman's stated framework, his big picture, his structure, all based purely on how it's summarized in this document. We're looking at the map he laid out.
Okay, so based only on this description, what do we know for sure about Kaufman's view?
We know he emphasized diversity within existentialism. He made that key distinction between the terms origin, Jaspers, Heidegger, and its popularization, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre.
He grouped those three as radical individualists.
Yes, and he stated they found previous philosophical systems fundamentally lacking.
And the main point, he frames their work, especially Kierkegaard's for religion, as an answer to the modern crises in religion, philosophy, and morality as he saw them in 1960.
That framework is clear and quite powerful, but it's just as vital to understand what we don't learn from this summary alone.
Right. Because it's a summary, it lacks the meat of the argument.
Exactly. It doesn't tell us the specific arguments Kaufman deployed. When he says systems were lacking, the summary doesn't detail which systems or precisely why he thought so.
And critically, for our interest in Kierkegaard, it doesn't show us how Kaufman used Kierkegaard's actual writings. Like which specific passages from Fear and Trembling or concluding unscientific postscript did he use? How did he connect Kierkegaard's critique of the church to the 1960s crisis? Right. We don't see that textual evidence or his interpretive steps.
Precisely. We can't evaluate the logic of Kaufman's detailed case based on this summary. We can't judge how accurately or completely he used Kierkegaard's complex text to support his thesis about Kierkegaard being an answer.
We have the setup, the categories, the conclusion.
But not the detailed analysis, the evidence from the source texts, the full persuasive machinery of the actual lectures. We're seeing the outline, not the full essay.
So we get Kaufman's big picture, his way of organizing these thinkers, his central claim about their relevance.
But we miss the depth, the nuance, the specific interpretations, the philosophical reasoning that would have made up the bulk of the lectures. Our view is shaped entirely by the summary we have.
Still, even with that limitation, the source description does give us a hint about how the lectures landed with people back then. It mentions reviews.
Yes, and they sound quite positive, don't they?
That's
Phrases
correct.
like wonderfully coherent and accessible intro. Great starting point.
And that the lectures provided deep insight and much to think about.
That's pretty telling. It suggests that even Kaufman's high-level framing these complex thinkers responding to big crises worked for his 1960 audience. He made potentially dense, difficult material feel understandable, engaging, like a useful way into these subjects.
So his approach, focusing on crisis and the individualist answer, must have resonated. It gave listeners a handle on these ideas and figures.
And bringing it back to you, the listener, today. Encountering even just this summary of a 1960 lecture is valuable. It lets you see how a major philosopher framed these thinkers for a specific historical moment. It gives you that particular lens crisis, radical individualism, the search for answers through which Kaufmann viewed Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre.
It's like a shortcut, maybe not to the full lectures, but to understanding Kaufman's pitch for why they mattered then. It highlights his conviction that their focus on the individual offered crucial ways to think about the big challenges of the mid-20th century, even if we don't see his full justification from the texts in the summary.
Exactly.
So let's quickly recap Kaufman's framing as presented in the summary. He saw diversity among existentialists, but grouped Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre as key popularizers and radical individualists.
He argued they found previous systems lacking in addressing the individual's reality.
And most centrally, he presented their work, Kierkegaard on the crisis in religion, Nietzsche on philosophy, Sartre on morality as an answer to modern crises perceived in 1960.
Right. We see how Kaufman provided this clear, compelling structure for approaching these thinkers, framing them as vital responses to contemporary problems, even though we only have the summary's outline of his argument.
So what's the takeaway? This glimpse into 1960 shows how these powerful thinkers were presented not as abstract historical figures, but as directly relevant to people's lives, linked to individual struggle and societal crises.
They were offered up as holding potential answers.
Which really makes you wonder, if Kaufman saw Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre offering answers to the modern crisis back in 1960, what does that suggest about those crises?
Are they still with us? Have the challenges to faith, philosophy, morality just shape-shifted? That's a big question Kaufman's framing leaves us with.
And if those fundamental struggles endure, how might these thinkers, or maybe completely different ones, speak to us today?
It definitely invites reflection on the enduring nature of these existential questions.
Absolutely. And if this look at Kaufman's framework has piqued your interest, we really encourage you to dig deeper. Maybe try to find those original Kaufman lectures if they exist somewhere online, or better yet, go directly to the source.
Read Kierkegaard. Read Nietzsche. Read Sartre. See for yourself how their ideas resonate, or maybe challenge Kaufman's framing, or speak to our own time.
Explore the crises and the answers for yourself. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Kaufman's historical lens.
Until next time.